Streaming live. Okay, live from Toronto, 5050 Yonge Street in the post-eclipse world. And as a person who was totally blind before the eclipse, I can tell you, didn't make a difference for me. I am delighted to welcome you to the meeting of the Toronto District School Board Special Education Advisory Committee. I am David Lepofsky. I am chair of SEAC for Toronto District School Board, and I'm the representative for Ontario Parents of Visually Impaired Children. Why don't we just introduce the people who are here in person? Go ahead. Who are you?
Thank you, David. I'm Richard Carter, representing the Down Syndrome Association of Toronto and also the co-chair of SEAC,
And
vice chair.
we'll introduce Rob, our guest, when we get to him.
Okay.
But in terms of SEAC members and staff, who else do we have?
Nora Green, Inclusion Action in Ontario.
Hello, my name is Effie Stathopoulos. I'm one of the centrally assigned principals for special education and inclusion.
Good evening, Nandy Palmer, System Superintendent, Special Education and Inclusion.
Katia Palumbo, centrally assigned principal of special education and inclusion.
Elizabeth Schaefer, centrally assigned principal, special education and inclusion.
Great, and we have Leanne, and we have a
Trustee
trustee.
McLean.
Leanne Dixon, I'm the SEAC liaison.
And trustee McLean.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan McLean. I'm the school board trustee in Ward 2, which is Central Etobicoke. It's nice to be here and reconnect with the committee. Thank you.
We have invited, or we are in the process of inviting trustees who are not members of SEAC to drop in, and we very much appreciate Trustee McLean taking the time to join in and to be part of our discussions.
We also have a number of people online.
Yep.
We can see their names, and I was going to say nobody in the gallery tonight.
Okay, do you want to just go through the names of who's online?
Or, you know what, I can't see them all on my screen,
Okay,
so.
you know what, in the interest of efficiency, as people contribute, if you just, when you're going to want to speak, and when Richard calls on you during our meeting, you could just maybe say who you are and who you represent in the process. That would help. Land acknowledgement, Richard.
Okay, thank you, David. For those of you that are able to stand, please do so. We acknowledge we reside on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, as well as the importance of establishing and maintaining cultural safety through learning from Indigenous peoples and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Approving the agenda, I'm going to ask to make two modest changes. One is reversing the sequence of item 4, which is the chair report, and item 5, which is talking about the People for Education report. Just going to do them in the reverse order. And there is, you'll note there is no 8. We are going to write in the 8 that was in invisible ink, which will be working group and association reports. With that, can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve, Nora Green. Do we have a seconder? Please raise your hand if you're online so I can see who the seconder might be.
I'm seconding that.
And who was that, please?
That's Leo.
Leo, Autism Ontario.
Thank you. All in favor, please raise your hands. Or is there a vote button?
No vote button.
Oh.
Anybody opposed?
Agenda approved, I trust.
Approved.
All right, conflicts of interest. Does anyone have a conflict of interest to declare in relation to our meeting today? Nobody? Nobody. All right. We have a delegation today. Is our
No, not yet.
not here yet, so why don't we proceed? And then if our delegation individual who wants to speak to us appears, we will slot them into our agenda when we can.
Trustee Hastings is also online.
Oh, Trustee Hastings, I am now told, has also joined us, who's not a regular member of SEAC, and I want to Trustee Hastings, thanks for taking the time to be part of our discussions, and feel free to chime in as an active member. So,
Thank you very much for that. I just dropped by to take a look.
okay, so we are going to move to our next agenda item after our delegation, and that's Rob Latanzio. Rob, if you want to come up front, I'm going to introduce Rob, and he will be a core focus of our meeting. So Robert Latanzio, full disclosure, is a long and good friend of mine, and we have collaborated on a large number of disability rights issues, federal, provincial, and local, including education. Rob is the executive director of the Arch Disability Law Center. Arch is a legal clinic funded by Legal Aid Ontario, which provides legal services to people eligible for legal aid. In the area, it's a specialty clinic that focuses on rights of people with disabilities. It's been around since 1980? It was there for its opening.
That's right. Incorporated 1979, opened our doors 1980.
And has argued important test cases at all levels of our courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, including important test cases relating to education. Arch provides legal representation and legal advice and has a service where people can call and ask for advice, so they have a capacity to see a cross-section of the kind of legal problems that people with disabilities and their families call in and seek help with, either advice or representation. And so 7 years ago, in February of 2017, when I was last chair of SEAC, we invited Rob to come speak to us about whatever he wanted, and then opened it up to questions from SEAC members. And it was an incredibly important meeting. It was at that meeting that we were, that Rob gave us a detailed understanding of the entire issue of exclusions from school, or refusals to admit, as they are sometimes called. This led staff to come back to us a couple of months later, acknowledging that the board, that TDSB then had no policy in the area, but needed one. TDSB worked with SEAC over the next several months on various drafts and got feedback from us. And I would say that in my 9 years as a member of SEAC, it is one of the high points of us making a difference, leading to that policy. So we've invited Rob back. And the way I'm proposing to proceed is as follows. Instead of Rob making kind of a speech, I'm going to ask him some questions for a few minutes. And the questions I'm going to ask, he's been told about in advance, and they're all based on issues that we've been talking about as priorities here at SEAC. So they're not just what's on my mind, but they're what I understand is on your mind. Then after Rob answers them, we're going to open it up, and we've allowed a good chunk of time to invite you to raise your hands and ask any questions you want. The only caveat that's important for everyone to understand is that Rob is a lawyer. He's a very good lawyer, but this is not the place to ask for a legal opinion or legal advice on a particular incident that's happened to a child that you know of. You can raise issues and describe things that you'd like him to comment on, but he can't, obviously, in an open meeting like this, give legal advice. So Rob, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us. Tell us of what Arch does in the area of education, and how much of of the work that Arch does involves education issues.
Interruption, David. Latoya has arrived.
Oh,
So do
okay.
we-
You know what? Latoya has arrived, Rob. Now that we've invited you up here, do you mind if we ask you to just pause for a few minutes while our delegation presenter speaks, so she doesn't have to sit and wait? Is that
Latoya,
okay?
if you want to come up here, that'd be great. Got her computer all ready.
Oh, great.
Perfect. Welcome.
Welcome. My name's David Lepofsky. I'm the chair of SEAC.
And I'm Richard Carter, the vice chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We're delighted to welcome you, and our formal rules are 5 minutes. Want to take more than 5 minutes? We've allocated 10 minutes for your topic, just don't feel constrained.
Okay.
And there's a microphone in front of you, I think.
Yes.
I hope.
Yep, there is.
So take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I first just want to say thanks for allowing me to be here and to share stories. That's what I'm here more so for, just to share stories. And I'm sharing stories, I feel like I'm sharing it amongst friends. I feel like I'm in amongst a group of individuals who will get me as I share these stories. You know, I feel that as individuals, you are people who have a keen understanding and an interest in helping students succeed. And that is just the frame and the mindset that I'm approaching these conversations with. I'm no expert. I'm showing up as mom, a member of the Inner City Community Advisory Committee. And I hope that I do a good job representing them and also representing my children, and that some of the later conversations that could be had around anything I share will also help other students as well. And so in this conversation, I'm going to be speaking based on how I identify myself. In terms of race, I am Black, but I'm Jamaican Canadian. So how I see myself as Black is probably going to be a little bit more different from someone who is Canadian or US born or of another country. I'm female. My marital status is single parent of 2 of the world's most amazing children. If any other parents want to compete, let me know. My education is master's degree in innovation and a bunch of other fun stuff. I have both, my disabilities are both visible and invisible. Sometimes they show up, especially my beautiful shaky hands right now. My superpower is basically having all of the above and having to navigate life as human. And I think that is something that we all have as a superpower, our own unique ways of showing up in this world. We're all human. We're all doing our best to just experience the world as much as we can and to leave it a better place. That's my belief system, and that's how I approach these conversations. So I'm going to share my family's journey and how those worlds combine, and I hope that ensuring that some of the languages that we use going forward in some of our advocacy, and if anything, it just reinforces some of the strength of the advocacy, because I can tell you, I think my backbone started to get built a lot more when I listened in on some of these conversations that you guys had, then I felt a little bit more stronger to approach tougher conversations at my child's school. So our first story, my daughter, a beautiful soul. She doesn't know height. She doesn't know danger. And she has sometimes the world's biggest smile, even if it's a little bit quirky. But sometimes her light goes out, such as experiencing challenge of not always being able to know that in certain situations you stay seated and that not everyone needs your help. When I'm going to call some of the teachers, principal, I'm just going to call them all adult humans or adult school adults, just to not single out anyone at all. When they sometimes face some of those challenging moments, they will look at her and they will see her as they are seeing the person. They will not always see the disability. And even just recently, she was told several times to sit down, and forgetting, like a lot of ADHD kids do, she'll stand back up and just need to walk and just de-stress to get back to her work, and she was sent to the office. This is not just one story, it is one of many. The adultification that sometimes happen with this beautiful soul, this 12-year-old, 11, she thinks she's 12, it's really challenging, as sometimes she's just handed with topics and discussions that are too big for her. But because it is expected that she should be able to handle it, it is handed on her, such as reporting on another student who, by the way, has their own disability, not very visible to the eye, and making comments that the school adults can put in the record of that other student. I don't think that's a conversation for a child. I think it's a conversation for an adult. But the challenge is from the school adults for them to face their own biases in terms of navigating these things, to see and to name why they are doing these things. Another student is a person that I'm working with, gifted on grade 1. They're gifted math decoding equation in 4 digits. When the parent brought it up to the school and went through all the SSD, a lot of things were dragged out. The parent was really not given the time of day to have this conversation and was dismissed because the boy is also autistic and he has other behavioral problems. So he was recognized as someone that's not gifted, and that school continues to show that there are no gifted students in that school. Sometimes our identities collide. We see someone as autistic, not gifted, learning disabled or with difference, but not gifted. Or we may have someone that has, just a beautiful way of representing art, and we don't really represent that in any of the conversation. We see just the behavioral challenge that they are showing up with, or what they look like, the differences. Part of this, I believe, is because we're human. They are doing their best to manage a lot of students and to make sure that everyone is feeling supported at the school. But at the same time, our children, especially in our culture that have disability, they are being missed, they're being underrepresented, and they're not being supported. And when the parents bring it up, they don't have the language. In Jamaican, my mother will never say that I have ADHD. She'll say, yeah, I get too much trouble. You are given too much trouble. That's the language we have. And we have a beautiful experience here where we have SEAC. It is an opportunity for us to share stories and for us to have different cultural experience collide in this conversation so that way I can develop, and so that way when other parents that show up to this conversation, they can feel invited in this conversation of disability. I'm doing my best to help a lot of individuals that's within my culture to understand that disability, it is not a negative on the person. In fact, I always say, I have my master's degree and I have failed grade 2 3 times. That story, though, it does come with pain because it meant that I had to go through some experiences that told me that I don't belong, that the disability is not just a disability, that is just that I'm a troublemaker or I'm not able to learn. And I had to learn to change that narrative for myself. And I will go back to my point where I say, I feel like this is the place where we belong. And I'm hoping that, some of these conversations that we have, we will do our best to just keep in mind the picture of someone that you were going to be using these words about, and think, how will that person feel in this place? Are they going to be feeling like they belong? Are they going to feel like their disability can be supported? Or are they going to be walking away from one more place where they just feel like they are not part of the conversation? And I trust and I believe that this is the right place for us to be able to better the experience at TDSB, so that way, unlike my experience where I was suspended many times and diagnosed later in my late 30s, 40s, around there, I was able to learn of a lot of things in university and change that trajectory for my children. Fought hard, and I'm telling you, some of the conversations you had, when I was having them with the principal, you reiterated them, and I could go back and say, here are the conversations, here are proof. So keep inviting us in with the languages that you use. That's it.
All right. I want to thank you very much for your passion and your presentation, which brings together down-home straightforwardness and a master's that brings together complex thoughts in a way that is going to enrich our discussions. I'm going to be speaking for a couple of minutes at your, at the Inner City Advisory Committee on Thursday.
It's great.
And I want to draw on some of the points you've made, if I may, in focusing on what we're going to do. But the other thing I want you to know is that your decision to come here today has led to a discussion which is leading Richard and I, and telling everybody this for the first time, to look into the idea of taking a meeting like October and just openly inviting parents and families to come and have kind of a town hall. And so your offer to come to us started the dominoes falling that led to the idea. And or you're the first at bat. But thank you for doing this. I hope you feel welcome to stay for the rest of our meeting. If not, if you don't have time and you want to be home to your family, then I'm hoping it'll be archived online, but I will talk to you Thursday, and thank you. And if people can, if it's okay with you, if people want to email either their feedback or their questions to you through Leanne Dixon, our wonderful staff support, we'd love to be able to do that.
Oh, I think I have a question.
We see Nora's hand up.
Okay, Nora, well, let's do it fast.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to thank you very much for eloquently coming and helping us remember that disability is only one aspect of a person, and that it's very much, in your lived experience with it, is very tied to other identities you carry, and that's really unique. And we need to, as a group, remember to fight for the success of each individual child. And that's the challenge for the staff, I'm sure, is that, we're not the off-the-rack group, we're the custom tailor-made group. So that prevents maybe sometimes people from understanding everybody's experience, but I really appreciate your coming because it reminds us everybody's is unique and that it's important to see all of a person and not just part of them.
And Bronwyn, I understand your hands up. We're
Yes.
over time.
Yes, I'll be quick. I'll just be quick. Thank you so much for coming. I have ADHD myself, later diagnosed, my daughter as well. My kids are also deaf and hard of hearing. I got goosebumps listening to you. Thank you. I can relate to so much, and we need to have so many more strong, brave parents like yourself to come, like David said. So thank you. I hope to see you again and many, many more families. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, LaToya.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. We can do the minutes.
Oh, we'll do that later.
Yep.
We'll do it later.
I'll bring
Do
it
it
to the
then.
end.
Yep, thank you for reminding me. Okay, is Rob back?
Rob is joining us back here. Yep, sorry.
So Rob, I was asking, what do you guys do in terms of education? Give us a sense of not what you hear, but what you've got, like what kind of issues come up. How much of your work is education related?
Thanks, David, and thank you so much for the invitation to come back here. Yeah, I can't believe it's 7 years, but it's wonderful to be here. So thank you, and hello, everyone. A lot of different type of issues. So maybe just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So David had mentioned earlier that at Arch, we do a lot of different legal things. So we provide summary advice to students and to parents on issues around education. We also do cases, and we do what we call brief services or limited retainers. So there's a range of services that we provide, and that's in the area of education, but we also practice in other areas of law as well. And sometimes there are some intersections with other areas as they connect with education. So to your question, David, in terms of, how much of our work is education and how, what type of themes come out of it or what type of cases, the starting point is that we really think about education as human rights lawyers. So we are first and foremost practicing in human rights law. We think about these issues through a human rights lens, and that may or may not, as we know, necessarily align with how we understand education within the Education Act. So to your question, quite a bit of our work actually is within education, K-12, JK-12, And we were talking briefly earlier, we're actually getting quite a spike of calls in post-secondary as well. So again, within a human rights context around the duty to accommodate in post-secondary. So from JK to 12, it really is a spectrum. But if I was to really summarize generally the type of cases, we have many duty to accommodate cases. So many cases that come through our door are about students who are just not getting the supports they need, students who don't have an accommodation plan or an IEP, or students who do, but the plan isn't really tailored or individualized for the needs of that student, or they have a fantastic plan, but there is absolutely no implementation. Or to take that further, there is absolutely amazing implementation for year one, and then you have a different principal or different teachers, and then all of that falls off the rails. We do
Actually, let me just interrupt for 1 second,
absolutely.
just so everybody in listening, either from SEAC or members of the public, Rob's talking about calls they get about education from across Ontario. This is not specific about TDSB. It's generically talking about the calls they get from across the province. I just want to clarify that. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that intervention. Yeah, I really want to underscore that. So nothing I will say this evening is specific to the TDSB. So again, giving you a sense of the type of calls and cases we get. The summary advice calls, we actually have our lines open to everyone with a disability across the province, no matter their eligibility for our other services. So that gives you a sense of the sort of breadth of the type of calls we get. We are a poverty law clinic funded by Legal Aid Ontario, so if there are more specific services or cases, we would then have to apply eligibility guidelines. But through our summary advice and referral, we feel like we're really getting a good sense of what's going on across the province.
So when you talk about the eligibility for your other services, they have to be sufficiently poor to qualify for legal aid, but for the summary advice, it could be any income level.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and we are a clinic that, well, we're a specialty clinic on disability rights, so we will first and foremost need to speak with a person with a disability. So in education, it's a little bit different. We'll work through that, but we would, wherever possible, also want to speak with the student with a disability. That's our first go-to.
Okay, now what I'd like to do is to focus you on just a few issues. I'm sure my colleagues will have follow-up questions and more, but issues that we have been and will be talking about, one of which is refusals to admit or exclusions from school, where a principal tells a family to either pick up their child or not bring the child to school, either for the whole day or part of the day. And you brought this to our attention 7 years ago, as I described, but I'd like to know how much of that you're receiving calls about, like how big an issue is that for you? And give us a sense of the kind of circumstances and what you've been able to do for families when you're representing them or advising them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. So it's still a very serious issue for us. It's really one of those issues that comes in very different ways, and sometimes it really depends on where that student is on that spectrum, on that timeline of things. So we'll have, for example, to give you some examples, it may start as a case about communication and the difficulties in communication between the school and the family, or it may start around issues as to whether an IEP is appropriate in the particular circumstances. And sometimes you can almost, in our files, you can almost really like identify where things go wrong. And so for example, I'll give you some examples of calls that we get. unfortunately fairly routinely, where, again, across the province, parents are being told that they can't have an IEP unless they have an IPRC for their child. So we know that's not actually the case, and that's not how the law is set up, and certainly that's contrary to human rights law, which is quasi-constitutional. But what that does, and what that scenario does, is start to create a situation where, you know, there are these lack of supports which start to compound the experiences that the student has at school, right? And certain expectations, certain situations start to develop. So when we have exclusion cases, whether they're formal refusal to admit pursuant to Section 265(1)(m), or whether it's what people refer to as, you know, soft exclusions or shortened days, you can start to identify that at the core of this is really a failure here to identify what that child really needs. What are those supports that the child really needs? And to begin a conversation to try to identify and provide those accommodations. So I wanted to touch on what LaToya had just talked to us about, because that intersectionality piece is so important, right? We're really needing to understand, again, from a very individualized perspective, because that's how human rights law works. It's highly individualized to that student. So it doesn't matter whether a school board may have particular services for particular children. It really is individualized. So it's about, you know, that student's disability, the way they experience their space, the way they experience education, multiple disabilities, other identities that they have, and all of that intersects and translates into what, in that particular context, for that particular child, makes those supports appropriate. And it's when those things start to break down that we start finding in our files that, okay, yeah, you know, the communication isn't as effective as it was, or things are starting to escalate when there's particular behavior, even though there is a plan in place, for example. And then we get to the point where students are being asked, or the parents are being asked to pick them up, or just to leave the school altogether. So
the chain of events that you're describing, that you've seen, is a lack of needed accommodation leads to behavioral problems on the part of the child, and then the school telling the family to take the child home. Is that the kind of way it unfolds? I'm not being in every case.
no, certainly not in every case, but it's definitely a theme that comes up in many of our exclusion cases.
And when now obviously people go to Arch if it's a more severe case. I would imagine people aren't going to go when it's just happened once and it's for an afternoon and then it's not a problem. But when Arch gets involved, if you do get in touch with the school board, whichever board it may be, I'm not asking and we're not going to discuss, what do you find happens when the child's got and the family has a lawyer like Arch there to make calls for them and take steps? What kind of a sequence of events have you seen happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, David, because there's a tension there. One of the things that we tell parents immediately, you know, during a summary advice call, for example, is that it is so important to maintain that relationship with the school. So it's so important to continue to work at that relationship, to continue to work on building those relationships and that effective communication. And sometimes when we get those calls, it might be a little bit further along, where there are some other strategies that need to be employed. But generally, we really are trying to make sure that there's going to be a relationship, there's going to be a safe, inclusive space for the student once all that is over, because the student needs to get back, you know, in that classroom, in that school, with their peers, with their teacher. So that's the priority, is to maintain those relationships and make sure that, you know, that as lawyers, we don't go in and make it so that it is all that much more difficult for the student or the parents to rebuild those relationships. So having said that, when we do get involved, sometimes it actually can be very helpful. And that also means that, for the most part, that counsel for the board gets involved. And, and that's the tension, because then one of the things that happens is that the parent no longer has that direct communication in the way that they did before they had legal counsel. So that changes the relationship in a very significant way. So these are...
So in other words, when the lawyers get involved and the lawyers talk to the lawyers, but the school doesn't talk to the parent doesn't talk to the school directly as much.
Well, that's correct. On certain issues, and sometimes we'll work together to work through a way that the parent continues, or we try to keep that communication going as much as we can. But
Right.
the reality is that for whatever issues we're retained on, that's our job, right? So we need to be speaking with the board directly on behalf of the student and the parents on whatever that issue might be. So the reality is it does impact that communication and that relationship.
All right, let me shift gears and just ask a couple more things. We've had a discussion at SEAC, which the staff have now taken back, and they're going to get back to us with their thoughts in September. And I want to just add to that discussion, if we can, about the idea of offering the board explicitly offering parents that if they'd like, they can have an IEP meeting with the board. That is to say, the family sits down with the school teaching team and collectively collaborates on what should be included in the individual education plan. So a number of members of SEAC have said that they think that, well, we've said that parents who know to ask, and they get a meeting. Parents who don't know they can ask, don't ask because they don't know they can ask. So the question is that we've placed before the board is, why don't you tell all parents of students with disabilities or special education needs that they can have such a meeting and explain what it is. And as I said, we're not asking the staff to respond to that now. They've taken it back to explore within the board. But what I'd like you to do is talk to us about the idea of offering, the school board offering it to the board, to parents if they want it, and explaining what it is. Explain it to us through the lens of human rights and disability rights.
So my first question, just for clarification, is that specifically to parents of students who have already been identified?
Whether they've gone through an IPRC or even if they haven't, if it's just,
okay.
The board is considering doing an individual education plan. Right now, they send a letter home explaining it, and at the bottom, it has a little box, tick here if you'd like to have a meeting with the teacher or principal. But it doesn't explain the idea of let's have a collaboration where we could sit down and discuss what could be in the IEP, and you could bring with you the people that may be supporting you in the community, and we could have a collaborative discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea would be that we're presenting is the idea of the board making this information available, and then families can opt to do it or opt not to do it. And I just want you to talk, we've talked about it as being a good idea. And I wanted to ask you, from your experience with education law and human rights law, about it through the perspective of human rights law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's really, I think, really interesting and aligns, I would say aligns with our understanding of human rights law as well. I think I'll start by stressing and underscoring the need for more information. So a lot of parents who call us really don't have a good sense of what their children can actually get as supports. They're not fully understanding the process. They're not fully understanding their role. They're not, for the most part, understanding that there are other obligations besides those within the Education Act on school boards. And they're ultimately not understanding essentially again, as we were saying earlier, the individualized nature of what this is all about. So from a human rights perspective, if we think about what the duty to accommodate looks like, there's a very important component to the duty to accommodate, which is that procedural component. And what I mean by that is when we think about human rights law and the duty to accommodate, our minds go directly to, well, what is the support, right? What is the accommodation? What does the IEP say that my child is going to get? In human rights law, how you get there is just as important. So there are some very clear obligations on service providers, and school boards are clearly service providers under the Human Rights Code here in Ontario, that will dictate how the school board needs to, or the school, needs to work through that process until that point where they actually have identified the accommodation. So what I mean by that is that, things like, as David just mentioned, having conversations, real meaningful conversations with parents, bringing in students, which is something that we, where appropriate, is really critical and important. But also, part of that duty also means that we need to start exploring, other expertise. Like there may be people who work with a student in, an after-school program or wherever it may be that may have some knowledge that they can impart and can help with the planning of an IEP or the planning of particular supports. And so bringing in all that information and working in a multi-party, type of process where everyone here has a stake in this and everybody's working together and bringing that information, having meaningful conversations, that's ultimately how we understand the duty to accommodate. So when we take that and we think about a process regarding IEPs, for example, I know a lot of my clients will just get the IEP and they'll just be asked to sign. Like that, in my mind, would not really meet that test of procedural duty to really explore and engage, in that multi-party type of way. So I think it's really important to be thoughtful about some creative ways of ensuring that you have those opportunities, that we have those opportunities to bring in people that can best speak to the support needs of every student.
This is really helpful. I'm going to ask one last question, and we're going to ask people to let Richard know, and he can do a speakers list. And you could maybe start doing that now, just as I'm doing this last question. Rob, I'm going to describe something which is common to school boards, but not the fault of school boards. It comes from the Education Act. The Education Act creates this program called special education, and it is provided for what it calls exceptional pupils, or pupils defined as having an exceptionality. And not all disabilities, as defined in the Human Rights Code, are included in the definition of exceptionality under the Education Act. So we've heard, any number of us have heard of instances where a family might want to get, for example, an IEP for a student, but a principal or somebody may say, but your condition is not an exceptionality under the Act. Can you tell us where that fits into the human rights lens?
Mm-hmm. So some of that ties into something I mentioned earlier as an example where, and again, just to be clear that in law, we don't need an IPRC to have an IEP. So with that starting point, to your question, David, it again comes down to the primacy of the Human Rights Code. So the Human Rights Code is quasi-constitutional. The Human Rights Code is very clear with its definition of disability. So disability in the Human Rights Code is what we call more of a social model understanding of disability. It really comes down to the experience of the person with a disability and their interaction with the barriers that they're dealing with, right? So when you think about that, and then you try to align it in some way with the Education Act, I think we're quick to realize that, yeah, the two don't necessarily align very well.
And if they don't align, which prevails?
The Human Rights Code prevails. And so what that ultimately means is that, again, whether there's an identification pursuant to the IPRC, whether there's an exceptionality or not, it doesn't mean that a child doesn't have a right to an accommodation. If they have a disability that is identified as under the Human Rights Code, then they have a right to that accommodation. So again, the definition of disability under the Human Rights Code is quite different than the definition of exceptionality.
Okay, that's enough of me. Let's open it up to SEAC. Richard, let's see how many people we've got, and we can figure out how to allocate time.
Okay, thank you, David. And I think we'll start in the room. I see Nora with her hand up, so she will go first. I don't see any other hands up at this point. I would like to put my hand up, but I want to give other people an option to put theirs up first. So please raise your hand on screen with the reaction so we know where you are in the line. Nora, please.
Thanks. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My question really is around IEPs. And I don't know if you've noticed a trend. I've noticed a trend in IEPs where it talks about service delivery in the IEP, because you were mentioning that it's important the family understand what the child's going to receive, like what's actually happening. And one of the things I noticed is there's a portion where it talks about services being like as needed and as required. And that's the language that's used in the IEP, which is pretty vague. And the family doesn't know if that means their child's going to be taken out a certain number of times, how many times they're going to see that staff, how many times they're going to see the people delivering that service. And so can a family say, no, I want you to be more concrete about that? And then, so that's sort of my first question. Can the family ask for more concrete explanation in the delivery of the service so they can monitor whether or not it's happening? And then secondly, if it's not, is the IEP a legal document that one can use to hold someone accountable, or is it not? So if someone's IEP is not consistently implemented, and you've gone through the sort of relationship building that you've tried, because to be honest, most of the reason I find families don't come forward is literally what you talked about, I call it the hostage taking, which isn't a very pleasant description of it, but the idea that there'd be the person who would feel the ill effects of the tension in the relationship would be the child or the student, and not the family who may be actually part of the conflict. So I guess the question is, in the end, when the IEP is done, A, can a family ask for specifics? B, is it a legal document that you can hold the board accountable to in law? And I had a C, but it'll come to me.
Sorry, I missed that.
I have a C, but I forgot it, so I'll wait for a second.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah. If you don't agree, who decides? When you don't agree on the IEP, who decides?
If it comes home with a please sign and return, and you think it should include more, what do you do?
Right. Okay. Well, hi, Nora. Thank you very much for the question. Questions, all three are great. I think I'll draw, again, starting with human rights law as our starting point. So generally in human rights law, accommodation plans actually need to be concrete. They need to be concrete until they don't need to be concrete, right? Sometimes we really need flexibility in a plan, and sometimes we have to be really, really careful and concrete about what it is that we need. The thing to keep in mind with an IEP or with an accommodation plan, it's not as we all know, right? We all know that this isn't a one-time thing. It's not a stale document. It's not static. That the obligation that service providers have is to continue to monitor, continue to revise, right? It's a living document. It's really a process more so than a document, right? So if we think about all of that, it could be that strategically, it could be that at some point, maybe we're not as concrete because we want to try some things, or we want to get more information because maybe we don't have enough information to identify some particular support. So there may be times where that may be helpful, and And then there are, more often than not, I think the need to really be concrete about what we're talking about. So, because we're trying to really create an inclusive space here that we can also monitor and identify if things aren't working. If we're a little too loose with our language, then how are we going to correct things if they're not actually working out right? So that would be my starting point. You know, again, if we think about IEPs as accommodation plans, and we have decisions coming out of the Human Rights Tribunal that say that. So from that perspective, you know, they're a plan that effectively, you know, is the expression of how the service provider will meet their obligations, right? So if a student is going to challenge, you know, and from a human rights perspective, that accommodation plan is really critical, right, to that claim, because that's the agreement, right? That the agreement between the service provider and the person with a disability in terms of what they need to effectively participate in an equal way in education. So it's a very important tool, which goes, you know, to the third point, the third question about what happens if you don't agree with it, or what do you do? And so what I would say is that, you know, it is very important that if we don't agree with what's in there, that we try to communicate what those issues are, right? And there are, you know, a number of effective ways to do that. But if you're going to agree to an IEP, then that means that you essentially believe that what's in that IEP will meet the needs of your child. So it's really important that you are part of that process, right? And that you agree. So if you don't agree, again, and there are a number of different ways to do this, but you want to identify what it is that you feel the IEP doesn't capture, and bring in that information and have those conversations. You know, sometimes the IEP is received in a way that parents might feel that there's a deadline and they have to accept, and they don't have a choice. But you know, but I think more often than not, no one's opposed to having these conversations. Like, there is nobody that's opposed to making sure that our students have what they need. There are just all these tensions and barriers, and, you know, support needs and scarcity of resources and all these things. But everyone is interested in trying to move things along, right? So that would be my starting point, is to really try to identify what it is that's actually missing and what's required, and then, you know, build essentially, you know, build that evidence to demonstrate why it's important, and bring that to decision makers to have those conversations.
And just, I'm just going to step in terms of clarifying language for my colleagues, because we in the law biz tend to use very precise terminology. The individual education plan is something that is prescribed under the Education Act and its regulations. You use the term accommodation plan, which is something that human rights case law talks about. Basically, if you've got a duty to accommodate, whether it's an employee, or that the employer has a duty to accommodate, or the school board has a duty to accommodate a student, the case law talks about possibly developing a plan of how that accommodation is going to take place. And that's when you refer to a term accommodation plan. They're very much in the same spirit, that try to achieve the same thing. One is under the Education Act, and it's constrained by all of that exceptionality stuff. The other is under the Human Rights Code and applies to all students with disabilities. Have I got it right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And if we think about guidance in the legislation or regulation around individual education plans, there really isn't much. And that tells another story. There is tons there about IPRCs, but really not much on IEPs, which is why we get a lot of guidance through human rights law and all that jurisprudence around accommodation plans and the duty to accommodate.
And just heads up to everybody, Nora's excellent question about essentially what do you do if you're not happy with the IEP. is going to be a topic that we will be exploring at greater length in terms of our own experiences and what we might recommend to the board later in the year. It's sort of on the drawing board. Okay, Richard, are you next, or?
I'm next, and then it will be Leo.
All right.
Thank you, Robert, for the presentation. My question spans over 20 years of experience with people with Down syndrome and young students. When parents typically go to the school to enroll their child in junior kindergarten, typically they're often told, without any other further evidence, we don't have the support in our school for your child. And basically, I have two questions that stem out of that. First of all, what support does my child need? Because I've only seen my child, they've identified potentially they have Down syndrome from a visual diagnosis, no other necessary evidence, yet but they've determined they don't have the support in their school, not having any idea what support my child needs. And the second thing is they never say what they need to do to get the support. It may be true they don't have the support in that school at the time, but there is two models of special education, or two parts of it, two deliveries. One is the ISP, and the other is everything else within special education. So if the child's not in an ISP class with whatever support's available there, what is available in the regular class, and why don't we have, and I've asked the board for this, a form that principals can fill out with the parents there that states, we do not have the support for your child in my school, and these are the things that your child needs, and then say, how do we go about getting this? So that's the first question I have. I'll stop with that, and then I'll come back to the second question.
Sure. I appreciate that your question was really focused around that initial, JK, SK, which we routinely get those calls. So before they even get to know the child, right? They're already making these determinations. I think though throughout the academic, life of a student, I think those kind of assumptions and biases, creep in as well at different touch points, and especially during transitions from elementary to middle school and high school and so on. But back to your question. So again, if we think about what we're really trying to get at here, which is like, what do these obligations really mean? The Education Act says certain things, but how does this all play out? And so it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around, both these procedural and substantive duties of human rights law. So, we cannot be making determinations until we actually investigate, right? There's a duty to investigate on the service provider to actually understand what those needs are. So that investigation might look like a meeting where people are brought in to have those conversations. Maybe experts are brought in from community, from the school board. But determinations, for example, to have someone not be in a regular class without any of those type of conversations, I would say, really aren't in line with our understanding of human rights law. So it's about understanding what the child needs. And then to your second point about, well, even if we now have a good understanding of what the student needs, can the school board just say, well, we don't have the supports here, we just have to send you to some other program? And what comes to mind is a decision that the Supreme Court of Canada had released, I guess now it's about over 10 years ago. It's called the Moore decision. And in that decision, they say pretty clearly that we can't think of special education as a separate program. So we're thinking about education in an inclusive way. And what that means is that also means we're thinking about the budget in an inclusive way, right? The overall budget. So it's not something that we can start to bifurcate or separate. We have to think about all of the resources at the disposal of the board, and what is it that the child needs, and how can the board provide those supports up to the point of undue hardship. I mean, that's essentially the legal test in human rights law.
And just to give people a bit of a broader sense of this that I've dealt with in the human rights context, well, not just in education, but the duty to accommodate is imposed on the whole organization. So in the case of a school board, it's the entire school board. If it's the government of Ontario, it's on the whole government of Ontario, if they're your employer. Government of Ontario cannot subdivide its budget into tiny little offices and say, well, you're only in an office of 3 people in the so-and-so branch of the so-and-so ministry, and accommodating you would be an undue hardship to the budget of that little office. It's got to be an undue hardship to the whole board. And similarly, in the case of a school board, a principal may experience it as, I don't have the staff to accommodate you, but it's not that school that has the duty, it's the whole board. And that's really important. Do we want to go to Leo before we come back to your second question, or you want to do your second question first?
It's very quick.
Okay, go.
So again, Robert, time and time again, you mentioned the breakdown can usually be traced back in the file to the communication where it actually happened. Is there anything that Arch has that could be provided to parents to kind of give them some of those communication steps and, you know, how to document things and what they should be, you know, keeping copies of, et cetera, so that it tries to streamline that and prevent that breakdown?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great question, Richard. We have a number of toolkits. We have some materials on our website, one more generally around human rights and education, another toolkit on exclusion, and another on service animals. There's some practical information. We have some videos. We have some some other information on the website. But I think where the information that's in those materials can be really, really important and empowering, but it's also really important to get summary legal advice at times early on in the process. And I'm not advocating for parents to go and get a lawyer. That's not at all what I'm saying, but understanding obligations early on, understanding the process that they're in, that can be really powerful, but also really important in the relationship and in the communication. Sometimes parents have a very unrealistic expectation, right? And sometimes it's the flip side. It's getting that legal information to understand, okay, maybe it's not quite the way we thought. So now I can engage in that conversation again with the school board with a better understanding of, what my child's right is and what their obligations are. So, consulting with materials and watching some webinars and that kind of thing can be really important. But again, these are fact-driven, individualized cases where it really comes down to your specific matter. And so really, at the end of it all, it's just really important to get good advice early on how to best proceed in whatever place they're in. Right?
Okay.
Rob, can you send me, if you guys have a summary link or list of those resources, if you email them to me, I'll get them over to Leanne and they can be included in our minutes, because I'd like to make that as publicly available as we can.
That would be great. I'd appreciate that. Thanks, David.
Okay.
Leo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. So I'm representing Autism Ontario. My question is always being discussed in the autistic community amongst parents. And basically, considering that we are in the midst of the budget season now, can you discuss the current landscape of provincial funding for special education in Ontario? More specifically, are there any legal avenues or strategies that parents, educators, and advocacy groups can use to maybe influence or advocate for increased or maybe more targeted funding at a provincial level to meet the diverse needs of our special needs students? And I think that's something that's top of mind for us. Thank you.
So that asks the tough question, whether to what extent you folks get involved in or even understand the morass of provincial funding for special ed. Mm-hmm. And if it's not a turf you're in, let us know, or if it's a turf you can give people guidance on in terms of how to do better. If you got a couple of pointers, let us know.
Yeah, maybe just some general pointers. I mean, those are issues, you know, in a case by case situation where we may want to, again, it depends where the issues are, where the lack of supports or lack of resources are coming from. Is it the provincial budget? Is it the school board? And certainly there have been attempts in case law to bring in the ministry, you know, in cases, I mentioned the Moore case, that was one attempt to bring in the ministry, in that case out of British Columbia. Just generally around, you know, making these issues known to decision makers as they work through the budget, you know, capacity building within communities, getting these issues out there. You know, I think that's always the case, right? Talking with politicians, decision makers, and, you know, more often than not, I think they're maybe not as aware of the dire need that a lot of our students are in terms of the lack of appropriate supports that they're getting, right? So, yeah, I don't have a magical answer there, but I think just continuing these conversations and bringing in people who need to hear these you know, these stories, for example, it's always helpful.
Okay, any other questions? I'm told by Richard we don't have any other hands up, so if not, I'm going to ask you one more thing, but not let you go yet. The one more thing is, can you just tell us if you've seen any trends in the calls you get? Anything different, like over the past few years, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, now, in terms of education issues you're hearing more about or less about, or is it all pretty much the same?
Mm-hmm. It is certainly not the same given the pandemic. I think things in pretty much every area of practice that we had, I think there was, you know, a layer or multiple layers of complexity that we had to work through, and I think we're still experiencing that. I think the cases maybe a little more subtly, but there's still some pandemic, you know, type complexities that come with it.
In education?
In education and certainly in other areas as well, but in education and I think we...
It's an illustration, not a specific situation, but just a sense of like what you mean.
Sure. So I think the most general example would be that during the pandemic, I think some of our clients really struggled in getting the level of education that they were, you know, perhaps used to getting. So the transition from school to remote was really difficult for a lot of our clients. IEPs weren't being followed, new IEPs weren't being developed. So, you know, in time, so a lot of our clients are back, a lot of our communities are back in school, but there haven't been very clear, deliberate plans to try to remedy and address, you know, the last couple of years, right?
In other words, catching up.
Right. So those are the, you know, and those don't come in as a direct issue where, you know, well, I feel like I'm behind a year, and, you know, those come in and maybe as a behavior case, but then you start sort of unpacking it a little bit. And yes, so they come to us because there's a behavior and now they're being asked not to go to school anymore. But then we start, you know, really exploring what happened over the last couple of years, because pre-pandemic things seemed to be going okay. And so you can start tracing back, you know. So there have been, in terms of trends, I mean, we have been really getting more exclusion calls. And again, that's refusal to admit is part of that, but also other types of exclusion. So we have been getting more of those in the last little while, which is incredibly concerning.
Trustee Hastings.
Oh, Trustee Hastings. I think you may still be muted.
We're not hearing you yet.
We're not hearing you.
Your microphone is showing as being off.
But his hand is up?
Yeah, like his hand is
I'm-
up. There we are. Your
Can
mic.
you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I've been playing with this. I've been playing with this for about a year and a half, but I still don't get it. But in any case, you've answered a great deal of my questions that I had. But what I'd like to do with your guests, two of them, have an
We're having trouble hearing you.
conversation. A good portion of what you described, as far as IEP and getting some at the case that we do need an IEP is the case where we don't have enough funds, and it's not the case. Not the purview of the parent or myself. It just should be done and take care of the fund later. It gets to be a little difficult and I've gotten in my corner of the world, which is north, west, Etobicoke, where I get constituents coming to me, and they're literally being given a hard time about getting anything done. And I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's how it is. And I'm wondering how to go around or go through or fix it, which is what I like to do. I usually don't like sitting around in these meetings. I usually like to get out there and hear and see the problem and see if we can fix it, me firsthand. Thank you.
Great question. So, Rob, we've got a school trustee who gets calls from families whose kids, at least from what he's being told by them, have needs that aren't being met, and they feel like they're getting a runaround at the staff level. From your experience, though, you obviously have gotten calls like that at Arch. What do you find, and you've got a trustee who's saying, what can I do to help? What would, from your experience, your council get involved in some of these cases and are able to help? So what, if you could give a couple of pointers, what would they be?
Thank you, Trustee Hastings, for that great comment and question. What would they be? I mean, I think, one of the things I should really share here is how a lot of, the folks who call us and the students that call us and the families that call us, they feel, for the most part, really isolated, right? They don't have many supports. They feel like they really are at the end of what they can give here. Like they feel like they're exhausted. They don't know where to turn. So having a trustee, for example, who will listen and help with trying to understand the process, or having a member of SEAC, for example, to help with advocacy. I can't say enough how that could be so important for families and for students. In terms of trying, if I understood your question correctly, and please correct me if I haven't, but again, in our experience, each case is really different. I mean, that's the nature of it, right? And so it really comes down to really understanding what is going on, and that can be difficult, but it also speaks to the system that we have here in Ontario, where there really is a systemic problem here, where parents really don't have anywhere to go. There is no real arbiter. There is no real role, an individual who can kind of take them through and really give them, sometimes the answers that they feel they're just not getting anywhere else. We have, I think we have cases where sometimes bringing in a trustee, for example, or bringing in someone in the community can help. Sometimes it's a question of just really having the supports around to understand the information. And sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes it really requires more advocacy and at times more formal advocacy. And unfortunately, at times it requires an adjudicative process where you can actually get full disclosure and really understand what's going on, you know, in a way that you can then identify exactly, you know, what is appropriate and what could actually be put in place for the student.
I'm just going to suggest to the trustee, because it's such a wonderful question, and I'm so happy to be able to bring everybody for us to bring everybody together to be able to discuss this. For what it's worth, and Rob, tell me your thoughts on this. The people, the teachers, the principals, the special ed people in this room here are, in my experience, to a person, really dedicated to the kids and really want to do the best they can. They too are overworked and exhausted, and they work in a system that can be very frustrating and that handcuffs them. And so what I would draw from Rob's answer and maybe add to is a trustee getting involved who asks the family what the problem is and then is able to call the school and sort of get their side may informally be able to kind of be a mediator to sort of seek if you can find some common ground. If both sides trust you, they trust you from different perspectives, but just getting a chance to get that common ground, and it may be that there has been a failure to communicate because everybody's so overloaded or somehow the message didn't get through, not from bad intentions, but just being able to clear the air and seeing if you could find some common ground could make a huge amount of difference. And even if they get together and talk about it when you're there, that may really help. And we are going to be at SEAC talking more about this also, about like, how do we come up with a way to help people resolve these disputes in a way that's great for the child, the student, good for the family, and good for the teaching staff and the board. Because the system doesn't necessarily make it that easy for all those people who want an easier way to do it. You say we have another question?
Trustee McLean, did you have a question, or were you just going to comment on the sound quality before?
No, I had a question, if that's permissible.
Hey, let's go for it.
Thank you, and through the chair. And thank you for the presentation tonight. It's been quite informative. I appreciate your perspective and your sharing of the knowledge. As has been referenced, you know, scarcity of resources is always a challenge, and I've been with the TDSB for 6 years and dealing with budgets, and you know, we constantly talk about the difference in the money that we are provided and that in which we spend in the area of special education. So my question is around your experience as it pertains to, you know, maybe other jurisdictions within the country and the law as it's developed and rulings as they've been made about groups trying to seek or changes in the laws or changes in the understandings that have led for a greater understanding for the ability for groups like school boards, for example, to claim, you know, to make the point with those agencies who fund them, you know, identifying the need for additional resources. So I was just curious if you were aware of situations like that that advance the cause, if you like, of families and individuals so that they could be better served by the organizations that are in place to do exactly that.
So have the human rights cases, Rob, at least off the top of your head, dealt with situations where a school board said, we'd like to do more, we don't have the funding. There's a duty on the province to give us more to enable us to do this. Has that come up?
So thank you. Yeah.
You may not know it off the top of your
Yeah.
head, because it's a lot of case law.
Well, but I can tell you that there hasn't been that order. Yeah, that's not. It's certainly not for lack of trying. You know, I think there have been some cases that have tried to bring in the ministry, and we're talking specifically, you know, in K-12. But the more decisions, the one that I again think about, because that decision really had a very positive decision at the Human Rights Tribunal in British Columbia. And then by the time it got to the Supreme Court of Canada, essentially the Supreme Court basically, really focused on the school board and the way the school board managed the money, and ultimately decided that, well, it was really about the school board not prioritizing services for people with disabilities. So,
Can you
essentially
give a
the
quick,
ministry.
like a 1-minute summary of Moore, because I suspect people don't know it or may not know it.
Sure. Happy to do that. So in 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada released a decision called Moore in British Columbia. It was a case coming out of Vancouver where the school board had decided to essentially close an intensive remediation program for students with learning disabilities. And so what the program was for short periods of time, students would go from their regular school, go into the program, and then sort of come out. And so Jeffrey Moore was a student who had been identified with complex learning disabilities, and it was clear to the board that he would really benefit from that program. And the school board had decided to close that program just around that time because the ministry had changed their funding model. So the school board had said, well, because of the funding model, we're closing down this intensive remediation program. And so the case made its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and ultimately what the court decided was that they really looked into how the board was spending their money. So if they were claiming they had no money because the ministry wasn't giving them enough money, which is sort of the question, well, what did you do with the money that you did get, right? And so they found that the board had invested money in other programs, other curricular activities, and so on. And so they found that to be discriminatory because even within, certainly not to say that the money was sufficient, but within the budget that the school board had from the ministry, that the Supreme Court felt they didn't actually manage that money in a way that would meet the needs of students with disabilities. I just wanted to your point, you talked about other jurisdictions, and again, I could say like here, we don't have a decision where the Human Rights Tribunal, will say, okay, we don't find the school board to be discriminatory and we're bringing in the ministry because there just isn't enough money. So we haven't had that yet. But, I'm thinking about other jurisdictions, and in New Brunswick, which is essentially a fully inclusive province, and I appreciate that it's a very different reality. Certainly Ontario is a large province, TDSB is the largest board, and so on. But I'm bringing this up just as a sort of a reflection that we talk about funding, sometimes in ways that, we sort of make this assumption that funding will solve everything. And in our experience, it actually isn't always really about funding. It's about a lot of different things. We heard earlier about biases and culture, inclusive school cultures, about leadership. It's about getting the right training, right? It's about the right supports for teachers and EAs and so on. So there are a lot of things at play, and not all of it has a dollar sign attached. So if we think about a jurisdiction like New Brunswick that has really changed its model, their funding is just going to different things, I guess is my point, that, some of this is systemic. And so sure, I don't think anybody would say like more funding is a bad thing. I mean, funding is funding and there's always a scarcity, but there are also decisions about where that funding goes and the current models that we're kind of stuck in. And is that the most effective way, right, to use our funding? So thank you again, trustee, for that question.
Last question will be Nora.
No, I think Rob just sort of answered what I wanted to comment, that it isn't all about funding, that a lot of it's about, so I was excited in the leadership report about the superintendent learning. I was excited about the principal learning because I think that's really important, and I think changing those attitudes is really important. I would like to say, though, that People for Education did one time collect data that said 68 out of 72 school boards exceed their special education funds to fund their special education programs. So I think if there's one thing I would say, and I often feel badly because I feel like sometimes I'm sure staff feel like I'm at them, but data drives. So what ends up happening, I think, is school boards feel like they have to protect themselves to show that they are meeting the duty to accommodate because we will hold you accountable. So that means that certain data, I feel, doesn't come to light, that if all school boards did that, we could prove to the province that there is a big issue that's not about the school boards and just their funds, it's about the province. But we need to know those numbers. So we need to have a school board that's going to be courageous enough that's going to say, we know we have this many kids not coming to school. We know we have this many kids modified. Last year when we said, we passed a motion that basically said, please tell your trustees all this data before they make a decision, because we wanted to make sure that trustees were aware of the situations kids were living with before they made decisions about budget. But some of the data that we asked for is not collected. And so that's the kind of information that if Toronto is saying that, and Peel is saying that, and Toronto Catholic is saying that, and Halton and York are all saying the same thing, and being transparent about that, about what's the realities, then maybe we have a chance, but that's not what school boards do. They try to prove that they're doing it okay, but I think, Rob's talked about how they shift their money, and I understand why, but I think somebody's gonna have to be courageous to talk about the reality kids live with so that we can actually go to the province and say, this is not enough, and it's particularly not post-pandemic.
Okay, what I'm going to do, thank you, Nora. What I'm going to do right now is shift to our next agenda item, but keep Rob here because it's going to be somewhat abbreviated, but I think, and we'll be back to Nora in a sec, I think that it's a natural flow from it. I just want to wrap up what we've done so far by first thanking Rob, second thanking all of you for your questions, and third, just adding one more point of my own on the cost issue. Cost is a legitimate concern, but there is ample chance to save money in how we serve students with special education needs, including students with disabilities. And it's an avenue that I regret school boards, including this one, are not taking. And that is implementing the kindergarten to grade 12 Standards Development Committee report, because it provides over and over strategies for making an accessible school system. And if we have an accessible school system, we don't have to spend as much time and money and resources accommodating kids. We still have to do some, but we don't have to do as much. Right now, to the extent that the board is trying to do inclusion, and commendable that they're working on it, they're trying to include kids with disabilities in inaccessible programs and classes, regular ones. Well, that means more barriers and more costs to accommodate them. And unfortunately, at the last meeting and elsewhere, we've heard from some staff that, well, the province hasn't yet, enacted a kindergarten to grade 12 education accessibility standard. No, the province hasn't. We're fighting to get them to. But in the meantime, the ideas are still there about how to make an accessible school system, how to tear down barriers, make it easier, less expensive to serve our kids. And we need to do that because that'll be a significant answer to the cost concern. Let's move to the, that's just my opinion. I'm not speaking for anybody else. Nora, we are going to do a shorter discussion of the People for Education report, but it flows from Rob's comments and helpful information for us. Can you, I asked you to do it in 5, can you do it in like 2 or 3 minutes? Just
Sure.
Introduce, especially as it relates to refusals to admit.
Yeah, so
And we'll open it up to people around the meeting to give comment. Go ahead.
And you sent the link out to everybody, right,
Yes.
to the webpage. So I'm assuming people have had a chance to take a look at that. And I guess I was just highlighting the fact that it was talking about the shortage of educational, well, teachers and educational assistants, but in particular, educational assistants. So much so that it was commenting that approximately half of administrators across the province, and I want to remind everybody, and I'm aware it's not all Toronto, This is provincial data, but I think provincial data is really important because that we just had the conversation about why it's not sufficient funding that the staff often get. I think educational assistance, you can see the crisis that's happening. But they said that 50% of principals are asking kids to stay home now. That was one of the concerns. And the other concern I really had was a principal who responded to the survey that People for Education had sent out. And this was over 1,000 principals who had responded, said that the most vulnerable were suffering because in order to cover classes when teachers are absent, they have to use special education staff or ESL staff. And I understand for an administrator, that's a safety issue in the moment, and they have the responsibility to make sure all kids are safe. But my concern about that is that drives the demand for ISPs because they probably aren't pulling ISP teachers, they're probably pulling the resource teachers in the building because they don't have students sitting in front of them. And now we don't have consistent delivery of service again. And so it's driving people into a segregated model or congregated model, and possibly people who don't want that but feel like that's more stability than what they would get in a regular class. So last year we had asked in our motion if the staff could report, and I figured they wouldn't have the staff because that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, just let me know. Yeah, a couple hours at a time. Yeah, thanks, Karen.
Sorry,
Appreciate
somebody
it.
needs to mute. We're getting
Yes.
crosstalk.
Good luck with this color.
Right?
Steve, can you mute? Oh, thanks. Last year, we had made a motion that the staff hopefully could give the number of times the special education programs had to be canceled, and that staff be redeployed to cover a regular class for a teacher who was absent. And they said they didn't take that data, and I appreciate it's a lot of data to collect for 600 schools, but I think this report highlights why it's important, because that's partially why I was asking Rob the question about as needed as required. So what does that mean in a place where, in a time when you're losing your service because there's just not enough people showing up to work? And you're being asked to stay home because your EAs, there's insufficient EAs in the province now to support the needs of the students.
Okay, let me just put a quick question to Rob, and then we'll open it up to feedback. And we're not asking staff to comment on the report. This is us giving feedback to staff today. But an observation, a question. This is not about TDSB. It's a survey across the province. But if we took the stats about principals telling a student to stay home because an education assistant is away, and if we cut that in, let's say, a quarter, like if it's 55% of, or something like that, over 50% for secondary schools, and let's province-wide. So let's assume I'm making an arbitrary assumption that at TDSB it would be a quarter of that. Like even if I assume that, I'd say I'm concerned. My question for you, Rob, is if a client called you and said, a parent called you and said, my principal told me to keep my child home from school today because their EA was sick, what would you be calling the school board and saying?
So I think the starting point here, just so we are, all kind of starting on the same footing, is that this, I would argue, is unlawful, right? You have, or we must remember that there is a right to education. So the bottom line is the student has a right to be in the school. And so the obligation is to make sure that the right supports are in place. So if there's an EA that's not there, then maybe this isn't the conversation that would happen that morning, but you would hope the conversation happens the year before when they're coming up with an IEP or a plan or a safety plan, whatever it may be around, those circumstances. So what happens? What happens with the transition? What happens with, it may also be a really bad idea to just have random people show up to work with that student. So what's the backup plan, right? So it's all about just exploring those possibilities, creating those plans, and then executing those plans. So that's really the starting point, is that we have to remember that the student has a right to be there like any other student. So the school really just has to figure out what supports need to be put in place when an EA isn't there, for example.
Okay, Richard, do we have anybody who wants to offer their feedback to the board from our committee?
I'm looking at my screen and I don't see any hands raised. I'm looking around the room and I see no hand. Oh, Nora has raised her hand.
No, like, just reiterating the data part. So again, just for a board to be courageous enough to take the data. So the question our trustee asked about, how do you go after the province when the school board's stretched? I don't feel armed. I want to, because I know how hard you're all working. I understand some of the frustrations and barriers Central staff have to supporting kids and helping school support kids. But it's very hard to do that when you're dataless. Like, what are we supposed to say? What are all the school boards, all the parents supposed to say? There's no evidence that school boards aren't meeting their duty to accommodate. So we just say so. So that's why, I mean, I love People for Education, because they're the people who go out in the frontier and try and take that data without sort of repercussion to anyone. It's all anonymous, it's provincial, but things like we need to know what's happening to the kids in hardcore terms so that we can go and say, you know, they're making cuts all over here and they're trying to leave special education alone. They're doing all these things to try and maintain their rights and responsibilities to this population, but you're making it exceedingly difficult to do so. And the funding for EAs, like from a salary standpoint, is ludicrous.
Okay, we have Julie and we have Bronwyn. I am going to drop my report from the meeting agenda to save time. I want to make sure we get staff report in, and we've got working groups to get in. So Julie and then Bronwyn, go ahead. Maybe if you could do it within 2 minutes, that would be great. If you need a little more, tell me. Julie? We don't hear you.
Your microphone's muted, Julie.
Do you want me to go quickly?
Yes,
yeah, go ahead.
So go ahead.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I just wanted to thank Arch Disability from the bottom of my heart again. As a family, we have used you for 2 occasions for the school board, but as well, I'm not sure if everyone knows about SSAH or UCSD, but there are definitely things outside as well for education that Arch Disability is amazing for to support families. I was very fortunate to have my children through Holland Bloorview with developmental assessments, and I was connected through them after we were declined, even though we were in severe financial debt for funding through the government. After proving how financially we were struggling, we actually did win through their hard work, and I wanted to thank you because we could not have gotten through financially with all the drowning debt we were going through as a family. So thank you again for everything you did. Thank you for Holland Bloorview. The thing I'm trying to make here as a point is that I am fortunate because I went through that system of having my children assessed with a social worker. When you are new to Canada, you start in the school system and you're in the TDSB. It's all about the teachers, and there's no social work support. So I'd like to see the TDSB staff at a higher level walk away from this and remember to connect on your own with your own support staff and keep Arch Disability as a resource for families who need support, where it's not just about the education system, but also about the funding to keep their children functioning and to have all the outside therapy that their school boards cannot support. So it's really imperative to be well informed how they can support our kids, and also please try and address this to bring it into families in the school boards. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Over to Bronwyn.
That was Bronwyn, sorry.
Oh, sorry, that was Bronwyn.
Now Julie.
Over to Julie, sorry.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Oh, okay, perfect. So I just wanted to just address Nora's kind of comment with regards to the teachers, like spec ed teachers, being pulled when EAs are absent. And as a teacher, as a spec ed teacher across different school boards, not necessarily TDSB, so I can't speak to what their policy is, but I can say that that is what happens generally. When I've been a spec ed teacher, I have been pulled weekly to cover classes. I mean, there's also been parent teachers that have been pulled from the parking lot in order to help as well, just because the need is real. So it is obviously an issue across the province that we're experiencing just with the lack of EAs as well as teachers. So, and that's where unfortunately it's pulled from the spec ed programs.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up this part of our discussion, thanking you all, with two things. One is, I think our understanding of what goes on and how often it goes on, and Nora's point, would be substantially helped if the school board used a unique attendance code for students who are not at school because of a direction from the school not to come. We would then know how often this is. We'd know what schools they're at. The school would have the disaggregated data, so they'd know also who's doing it. And that would be a wonderful way so it's not just word of mouth that a superintendent says we don't have any or whatever. I'm not saying that's what goes on, but I'm saying that it would be a direct, the student wasn't there. They have to mark the attendance. Right now, it is not required to be by a unique refusal to admit or exclusion attendance code. If they did, we'd know, the board would know a lot more quickly. Rob, I want to thank you for your time, and can you tell SEAC and our YouTube streaming audience, if people want to avail themselves of the summary advice at Arch, what number do they call?
So the best way is to just go on our website at archdisabilitylaw.ca, and all the contact info is there. And there's also a page that gives you some information just to prepare before the call. So there's some information for you in advance of scheduling, and information about our process and how we schedule our appointments. Thank you, David.
All right, Rob, thank you very much. And you don't have to sit up front here anymore if you want to go back to the cheap seats.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask if, Nandy, if we could proceed to the staff report.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to present the leadership report for this month. We have been focusing precisely on what was just mentioned in that presentation, which is around training and capacity building for staff at all levels. And starting with our superintendents for a family of schools, we held a session in March on changing mindsets for superintendents of education, specifically in the areas to challenge these three beliefs. Early years students who demonstrate learning challenges automatically have special education needs. Students are better served elsewhere, such as in intensive support programs in integrated or congregated sites. And students with special education needs are better served by special education teachers. And in fact, that was one session that we were given time to do, but more learning was needed. So we are actually going back next week to do a second session on mindsets and biases and beliefs with superintendents. In addition to that, we've been focusing on drop-in sessions for principals and vice principals. Because of the staffing shortage, it has been challenging to release principals from their schools because they themselves are covering classes at times to engage in professional learning. So we have offered drop-in sessions where principals and vice principals can come and attend some learning sessions around special education and ask any questions they might have. We've also had professional learning for our diagnostic kindergarten classes, which are ISP classes, as you know. However, the idea was that they would learn alongside regular kindergarten teachers. And this is helpful because even though they're ISPs, we need them to follow the 4 frames of the kindergarten program, which is also helpful for students who might be transitioning back to the regular class from an intensive support program. we're happy to announce that our special education and inclusion summer school program will be running again, and information is on the website for families to access, and schools were also asked to send home the flyer information so that parents can register for special education and inclusion summer school, which will run from July 2nd to July 26th of this year. Please note that applications must be submitted by May 3rd. We also will be having ECPP, or Education Community Partnership Program, summer program, and those students actually come through the summer school from our partnership with agencies such as Humber River Hospital, Sick Kids Hospital, Fernie Youth Services, and so forth. We have a blind and low vision program newsletter that has been a tradition within the TDSB for many years. And this allows for student voice and student agency, and they're very proud to share their perspectives with their peers. And the newsletter is available in various accessible formats, such as Braille, large print, and AODA compliant formatting for screen readers and audio formats as well. Our deaf and hard of hearing field trip was a grand success with 163 students from junior kindergarten to the age of 12 who participated. And for many of these students, it was the first time that they had been with other students who also had hearing differences. And it was a very successful and enjoyable day, and lots of positive feedback was received from families around that day. And there is a video that was shared on Global News by a father and their child, Mateo, on how they can learn. And it was featured for World Down Syndrome Day, where the parent and the child were trying to raise awareness about World Down Syndrome Day and educate people about Down syndrome. And the link is in the report for anyone to view it. And that concludes my leadership report. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nandy. I'd like, if we can, to end the meeting on time. So let me know if people have questions they'd like to ask now. And if not, you can always email Leanne and they can be passed on to Nandy. Do we have any questions at this point?
I don't. I see one question in the room, Nora, but none online.
Right, Nora?
90
seconds.
I just had a quick question about the frequency of the PL for the superintendents. So you had one session, are you doing another? Like how often, how much? And I guess the other part was, does it include also, I just found like with equity work, understanding the history of a people is important because it gives you some understanding of what they've lived through or what they experience. So does the PL include like the history of Huronia, forced sterilization in our country, the history of people with disabilities?
Thanks, Nora. So last year, we actually did 2 half-day sessions, which was great. That was a lot of dedicated time for not just family of school superintendents, but the entire senior team. So we had people from the business section, finance, IT, all of that. And that's where we went more into human rights, legal, historical, everything pieces, processes, everything. This year, we're really trying to hone in on the mindsets and biases pieces, and it is in response to what we've been hearing from SEAC as well around, some of those comments made earlier about we can't serve your child here. So we need to build the capacity of superintendents that is not acceptable so that they can go back and lead that learning and build the capacity of their principals and vice principals as well. So that is the focus for this year. But in short, yes, we have done that kind of training last year with senior team. With regards to frequency, it is the second time that we're presenting to senior team this year. Next week will be the second time. Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to working group reports. K-12 does not. You've got budget reports.
We have the trustees report first.
Oh, we'll do the trustees report after.
Okay. So on the working group, I've called on both Tracy and Nora to just quickly comment on what their presentations were with regards to FBEC and how it applies to the budget and what sort of feedback you may have received. So Nora, if you want to go first, and then I'll ask Tracy.
And if you could do it in sort of summary form, that would be great.
Sure, I spent a lot of time trying to prove we couldn't afford cuts. with data to get there, and the trustees sort of informed me that they hadn't planned on cutting special education. So my understanding is that's still true, that special education will not experience cuts?
Yes.
Okay.
At this point, yeah, that's.
Right. Which is way ahead of where we were last year. So right now, there are no anticipated cuts to the special education supports and services from the Budget Committee.
To which I say, yay.
Yeah. So there you go. I'm done.
And Tracy, please.
Yeah, thanks, Richard and David. I did have the opportunity to present on behalf of Community Living Toronto on March 26th. Our purpose was the same, as very in line with what Nora was saying as well. Community Living Toronto, as a very large organization, has been hearing from many parents in this recent school year, really growing concerns around exclusion and modified day. So we wanted to make sure that the trustees heard that piece. And also we wanted them to be aware of the growing trend of parents having to either reduce employment or leave employment altogether to address the needs of their children who have been sent home, expecting that the children will be in school full day, and then having to constantly either pick their children up or stay at home. We wanted the committee to hear that.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. And we appreciate both of you taking the time to take those steps.
David, could I add one point?
Sure, go.
And basically, thanks to Robert Latanzio again for his comments, essentially saying that it's not a matter of going back to the province for more funding necessarily. It's finding the funding that the school board has and how they're spending it. Because this is spoken to a comment that I've made several times to Craig Snyder, and that is that the school board always finds the money somewhere to solve the problems within special education. So it really is about the, not to say that funding is sufficient, but it really is about the allocation of funding, how it's spent, and being creative in how the board uses those funds to serve all the students in the best possible way as required. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, trustees' reports. Do we have any trustees either who are members of SEAC or who are visiting today that you'd like to share with us?
Sorry, David, forgive me. This is Leo here. Do you mind if I just make one question? If we don't have time, that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point because it's something I've been hearing back from parents. I think regarding the budget, I think it is laudable that what we're hearing, that there won't be any special education cuts, but I think that special education does not exist in, as we all know, it doesn't exist in a bubble, and so the reality is that if overall funding is suffering cuts, special education in many ways ends up suffering indirectly. For example, many parents I've been listening from, and principals including, some schools are getting less EAs this year. And what that happens is that the thing that we just discussed a few minutes ago, that EAs are being pulled from special education classrooms because they have to fill in the gap in other places, starts happening more and more. And so even if it's not being reduced directly, indirectly, it is getting affected. And we're hearing from some very concerned parents and principals who have come to us anonymously to say that, you know, the effect of losing general staffing ends up affecting the special education population as well. So I just want to put that out there because sometimes it's not so clear cut and we don't live in a bubble. So thank you.
Leo, it's appreciated that you're able to sort of get us that information because we need it. I'm going to look at our time and say we've got trustees reports, association reports, and approving 2 months of minutes. Trustees, anybody want to chime in? If you don't want to, you don't have to, but if any of you have any reports, feel free. Anyone raising their hands?
Not seeing anybody, because we have, I believe, Trustee Patel and Hassan on there, Trustee Hastings, and Trustee McLean.
Okay.
Trustee McLean has his hand up. Go ahead, Trustee McLean, please.
Well, I'll go in the absence of my colleagues. I just wanted to thank ladies for coming and sharing to FBEC, and we benefited from the conversations. I've been with the board 6 years, and we've had deficit budgets for 6 years, and I don't remember a single conversation in that time about reducing the budget for special education. we've got lots of challenges, and we never look to that area to try to fix them. So there's been lots of talk about a budget. We had hoped to get it done in the spring. We had set an ambitious timetable to try to get our budget done. There are staffing realities that are beneficial for us. The earlier we get it done, there's about 10% of our staffing that we can't approve until the budget is formally completed, which puts about 10% of our staff in kind of no man's land a little bit because we passed some contractual dates. So there was an advantage to getting it done early. We were unable to do that, although we are further along than we traditionally are at this time of year. We have done some, and we have moved towards that, but we are still not there, and we will wait for the GSNs, and the FPEC will continue to try to identify potential areas that will help us, but we're currently in a deficit situation that we have to address by year's end to the neighborhood of $10 million. So the work is ongoing, and that's...
All right, that's great. That's very helpful information, and thank you. I'm going to now ask, are there any association reports that we need at this time?
Not seeing any.
If not, could we have a motion to approve the February minutes? And then if anybody wants to add to them, let us know. And then we need a motion to approve the March minutes, and then we're done.
So do we have a motion to approve the February minutes? Nora, moving the motion. Do we have a seconder for that motion?
I can second that. Leo?
Seconding. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none opposed?
Motion to approve the March minutes.
Motion to approve the March minutes. Looking around the room. Nora? Do we have a seconder for the March minutes? Leo?
I can second
sorry,
that.
not
Leo?
Tracy. Thank you, Tracy. Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none opposed, carried.
It is 8:57, and either someone can raise other business and therefore ruin my record for keeping us on time. Feel free to. Or we can have a motion to adjourn. Any other business? All right, can we have a motion to adjourn?
Anybody like to motion to adjourn? I'm not seeing any hands. Nora? And I don't think we need to second that. All in favor? None opposed?
Any opposed may stay in the room.
I think
Thank
George
you
may have
all
seconded.
very much, and we'll see you next month. I would invite, if anybody has feedback on the meeting, feel free to email Leanne to be forwarded to me. I'd welcome it either from the public or members of the committee. Just eager to get your feedback because it helps us know how to proceed with our next meetings.
Good night, everyone. Stay
Good
well.
night, everybody.